It's wonderful to see you crowd here this evening. Thank you very much for your welcome. It's a great privilege to be here in Faringdon and with 1 R. I used to commute to Faringdon with 2 Rs, so I'm very familiar with Faringdon, but the other one. So, but great to be here and to tackle this really, well, quite challenging topic, I think. I hope you'll find it challenging this evening. Of course, this topic, this question, this title poses for us a choice, and there are many different ways of being faced with a choice for things. For example, if I'm offered a choice between a vanilla and a chocolate ice cream, I really do have to make that difficult choice. There are no two ways about it. The choice has to be made because these are two competing types of the same kind of thing. But let's imagine now I'm offered the choice of appreciating the beauty, the aesthetic beauty of an ice cream, and also enjoying its taste. I might want to say, well, this is really a false choice. In reality, I can both appreciate its aesthetic qualities, which I do, and I can enjoy its taste as well, because here the choice is between two different aspects of the very same kind of thing. And that's really what we're going to be thinking about this evening. Now, there clearly are some people around who think that the answer to our question is yes. This evening, you really have to choose between creation and evolution, and some of the so-called new atheists think in this direction. Here we have Dawkins writing, and I quote, that I pay religions the compliment of regarding them as scientific theories, and I see God as a competing explanation for facts about the universe and life, close quote. So, in this account, therefore, quite clearly, God and science are seen as offering some kind of a rival account for the reality around us. It's got to be either creation or evolution, either science or religion. You can't have both. And it was Dawkins who once proclaimed in, I think it was a Channel 4 TV program, that Darwin removed the main argument for God's existence. That's quoting Dawkins. Now, I find it actually quite interesting, quite curious in a way, that those closest to the sort of, if you like, the Dawkins type of philosophy of science are young earth creationists who think that their religious account is in some kind of rivalry also with our current scientific understanding. And so, that, like Dawkins, they also would agree that the answer to the question this evening should be yes. And I actually have a feeling, although it's hard to find hard evidence for this, that the kind of rhetoric of the new atheists has somehow increased the popularity of creationism. Because if you keep telling religious believers that evolution equals atheism, then often enough they might start believing you. And this seems to be sort of Dawkins' propaganda style in this way. If the word evolution is continually associated with atheism in some way, then eventually people will start thinking that one actually implies the other. And in fact, if you look back in history and you look at the history of scientific theories, you find often that the big theories of science can become invested with all kinds of barnacles, if you like, all kinds of ideological accretions that don't really belong to the theory itself. And so here you have this sort of typical process outlined here. You have a big theory comes along, like evolution, for example, 1859, becomes very successful. And then you have various interest groups who try and move in and kind of utilize the prestige of that theory to promote their own particular ideology. So unfortunately, the end result is that in the public consciousness, the actual meaning of the word starts changing. And so you get theory X, which then becomes, as we say, socially transformed into meaning Y by this long process of ideological borrowing, if you like. And if there is anybody here with a particular interest in the sort of historical aspects of that topic, I brought along one copy of this book, a rather specialized book, Biology and Ideology, from Descartes to Dawkins, which is a whole collection by historians of the way that this sort of ideological use of biology in particular has happened many, many, many times since the year 1600. Quite a fascinating book, a little more specialized than we're going to get into this evening. But if you look at evolution in particular, of all theories, since 1859, it's been used in support of capitalism, communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism, and lots of other isms apart from those as well. And some of these, of course, are quite mutually exclusive. So when you look at that list, you think there's something a bit strange going on here, really, that such a theory could be used in some positive way, according to its proponents, to support a particular ideology, all these different ideologies. But I think that kind of process helps us to understand maybe a little more of the sort of conflict that goes on in the USA in particular, where creation evolution topics are rather hotly debated. I don't think that's so much the case over here, as far as I know, anyway. So the question then is, well, first of all, is there a sort of more useful way at looking at the different kinds of insight or explanation that we might come up with for the world around us? And I want to suggest that there is. So I want you to imagine for a moment that the reality of life, this book of life we call it, is like a cube, and it's divided into many different layers, and each layer represents one particular insight or way of looking at the world, a way of understanding the world. And by life here, of course, I mean all that we experience as we go through life, not just sciences, but everything that we experience. And so the suggestion then is, as we look at our little model there, that each level represents one particular mode of explanation. So we have the scientific mode of explanation, we have the ethical mode of explanation. We're asking questions like, what ought we to do in the world? How ought we to apply all these wonderful scientific discoveries and so forth? We have the aesthetic understanding of the world, what we count as beauty. How do we judge beauty in the arts and in the humanities and so forth? We have our own personal level of understanding the world, our own unique personal biographies, which obviously we can't publish in a scientific journal, but which are, at the end, the most important type of account for our own lives. And then we have the religious, philosophical big questions that we would like to ask at various points in our lives, no doubt. Why is there a universe? Why does it bother to exist? Sort of Stephen Hawking's kind of question, what breathes fire into the equations? And so on, these great big questions of life. Now, the point about this very simple model is simply to underline the point that we need many different narratives to do justice to the reality around us. And these are complementary narratives. There are no necessary contradiction with each other. They might be, but there's no necessary contradiction. They're different narratives. We need them all if we're going to sort of begin to understand the complex world around us. And of course, if you think about it, it's the way that our universities are constructed. We have different departments, we have different faculties, and each department, each discipline has its own particular way of understanding the world, and also what counts as evidence, what counts as a good explanation in that discipline varies. There are many different ways of knowing, and our universities illustrate that fact. And of course, also we need to be careful in these sort of models. We're not saying these are isolated, separated compartments of knowledge, but rather they're all really integrated. They're all one big, unity in a sense, but it's just we are limited human beings with limited brains, and we just need to break up the different disciplines in order to get our heads around what's going on here. Okay. Well, this is to point out we need clarity in this discussion. We need to know what kind of level we're thinking about, what kind of ways of knowing are we thinking about in this discussion this evening. We need to think about, first of all, what Christians mean when they talk about creation. We need to think about what biologists mean when they talk about evolution. So, and for clarity, of course, what we need is some definitions and some understanding of those things. So, creation or evolution, do we have to choose? Well, it depends very much what sort of model here we're thinking about. Are we thinking of incompatibility because we just got to choose between two separate things? Is it more a question of this sort of complementary type of model that I'm suggesting to you this evening? So let's start a little bit this evening by thinking about evolution. Apologies here to all of you biologists out here. But I know for some people here this evening, this is a kind of interdisciplinary audience, and therefore maybe for some people biology GCSE was a few years ago, and possibly a little summary at least of what we're talking about might be helpful as a kind of refresher at least. So let's start by thinking what evolution is not. Evolution is not a philosophy, although as we've just been thinking, some people have certainly tried to make it into one. It's not some scientific plot by atheistic scientists to try and undermine belief in God, although maybe there are a few people who try and do that, but that's not what it's really about. Rather, evolution is our biologists' best explanation that we have to explain the diversity in the biological world, both now and in the past. And indeed, of course, it provides the framework within which all current biological research, all biomedical research as well, is carried out, and it's a framework which is shared by people of any faith or none. And so it was Darwin's brilliance, I think, to bring history, if you like, into biology. It's a way of uniting, actually, some different disciplines together. In Darwin's language, it refers to descent with modification. That's what he liked to call it. I had this wonderful picture of the tree. I think it's very familiar to everybody. The fact that everything is connected by an evolutionary history, by common ancestors, and you can track back down the tree. The fact that we all share the same genetic code this evening, we all share the same type of cellular structures, we all share the same elements as the rest of the biological world, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and so forth, all made in the dying moments of exploding stars. And of course, without those elements, life, carbon-based life, would certainly not be possible. There is no current rival theory to evolution. This is the one that's the paradigm within which all biological research is carried out. There certainly remain big debates about mechanisms and so forth. We might touch on those a little bit later. But the theory is not static. It's not a static theory. No theories are in science. Itself is an evolving theory, but it is the one that provides the paradigm, as I say, within which we carry out our research. Evolution is actually, biological evolution has often been likened to the evolution of languages because you can construct very similar kind of trees of linguistic origins in the way you see there on the slide. So every language has a last common ancestor. If I want to find out the last common ancestor of, let's say, Old German, I can work up and see that it's between Dutch and German. The last common ancestor then is Old German and so forth. So you can track back through linguistic trees in a similar parallel kind of a way, actually. I just want to remind you that when scientists talk about the theory of evolution, they're using the word theory in a rather technical sense, which is different from the way we use it in everyday speech. Here's some Republican politicians in the USA. You probably don't even remember these people. They were once trying to become leaders of the Republican Party there. But I put these quotes up because I think it sort of illustrates this point. Here's Rick Perry. Evolution is, he says, just a theory that's out there. Ron Paul, another candidate, says evolution is a theory and I don't accept it. And I think this sort of illustrates something of the misunderstanding of the word theory out in the public domain. By the way, I think America is the only country I think I know of where it actually makes a difference politically what you actually believe about evolution. It always comes up in campaigns. It's quite fascinating. I just can't imagine Theresa May being asked about evolution, but I may be wrong. You never know. Anyway, in science, though, coming back to the point here, the word theory means really something quite different from, a kind of hope that it might not rain tomorrow or whatever it is, something uncertain. It's often likened to a map which draws together many different bits of data to kind of make sense of it, to this sort of coherent, overarching big idea that draws all the data together and makes a narrative that's coherent and actually makes sense to us. So clearly when scientists talk about the theory of gravity or the theory of relativity, things like that, they're not really expressing doubt that they actually disbelieve. They might disbelieve these things, but rather they're referring to these maps of reality that actually make sense of a whole bunch of data, be it in cosmology or in this case in biology. So it's a sort of technical use of the word I think we want to keep in mind here. And the reason that scientists, biologists in particular, use evolution every day for their research programs is because it explains so much so well. And at the time when Darwin was still on his great voyage of the Beagle around the world, there were lots of fragmented data, things that they knew something about, a lot about geography and physiology, nothing about genetics then, but certainly anatomy of animals, fossils, that kind of thing, vestiges, lots of different isolated bits of data. But it was only really when evolution came along that it then joined up all those bits of data and made a coherent story. It actually made sense. And that was, of course, Darwin's brilliance to propose a mechanism for descent with modification, natural selection, that actually makes sense. And we can just pick almost at random something here. The vestiges, when we put up vestiges, these are those remnants, if you like, left behind in us and many animals and plants indeed, which reflect our evolutionary past, where actually you can see something still in us or in whales or wherever it might be that reflects their evolutionary history, even though it's not in use in their present existence. I mentioned whales because that actually provides a rather good example. If you go to a natural history museum, a good one, and you see a baleen skeletal whale hanging up with little cords going up to the ceiling and so on, you might see look out for it, a very small little bone, actually it's a leg bone, which is hanging up all by itself, which is correct because this is actually the little vestigial hind leg bone, which is in all baleen whales, about 1 out of 500 actually sticks out of the back. It has no function. Most of the time, it's just embedded in the flesh in the back of the whale and so forth. But of course, it's a vestige of the evolutionary past, the evolutionary history of that whale. It's a mammal that once lived on the earth and it needed legs and so on. So this is a typical type of vestige of the past. We are sitting here, we have tails, I don't know if you know that, but we have in fact, now and again, babies are born with little tails, which fortunately can be removed surgically. We have the genetic information to make tails in our own beings as we sit here. We have vestiges of our evolutionary past as well. I'm kind of glad that we don't have tails. I think it'd be really inconvenient. I just keep thinking that, especially if you go and sit in a pew, some of these old-fashioned pews. I mean, where we toss it over the back of something like, I don't know, anyway, but I'm really glad I don't have a tail. So there we are. So evolutionary theory, then, it's come a long way since Darwin. In its modern form, then, it involves 2 steps, really. For Darwin, there was just 1 step, but here are the 2 steps. So phase 1, step 1, if you like, is that you get variation coming into the genome. The genome is simply the DNA in our bodies, the sum total of all that genetic information that we have. And there are many, many different ways in which variation can come into the genome. It comes in through sexual reproduction, it comes in through mutations, it comes in through gene duplication. Sometimes the whole genome is duplicated. Very rarely in evolutionary history that's happened, and so forth. And so what happens is with these slight variants in the genome, so you get, in this case lions, you get slightly different lion cubs, and there they are, and they look the same there, but they're slightly different. Okay, so one can outrun the other, one's a little bit better at catching prey and that sort of thing. So in a sense, here you have, this is the second step then, when you get the bit that Darwin discovered, natural selection, whereby those variant genomes are tested out in the workshop of life to see which one generates the animal which is, if you like, the most successful, which is most likely to pass on its progeny to succeeding generations. And that is a process which we call in evolutionary biology reproductive success. Herbert Spencer, who was living at the same time, philosopher at the same time as Darwin, came up with the term survival of the fittest, and Darwin didn't take it on immediately, but he took it on later on in some of his writings. It's not really what's going on here. Obviously, animals and so forth need to survive in order to reproduce, fairly obvious, but reproductive success actually is a better phrase to describe what's going on here. And you can summarize evolution very pithily here in GIP. Genetic variation happens, individuals are selected, populations evolve. So if you have any offspring doing biology, GCSE, something like that, and they want a simple way to remember the sort of core Darwinian evolutionary theory, this is what it is. It's good to remember that very small changes can make some pretty big differences and at the genetic level. Illustration, domestic dogs, which of course have been artificially bred for centuries, and they range, a huge range. When you just look around the street, you've got a 2-pound Chihuahua, and then you've got a 150-pound English Mastiff, and I've often thought that if paleobiologists in 100 years' time, 10,000 years' time, had never seen dogs before and they dug out the fossils of these, they might well think they're different species, but of course they're all the same species. They have the same chromosome number. There are 36 known species of dog known in the world today, and yet domestic dogs far outweigh them in terms of just variety and so forth. But the reason I show this slide is to say also that about 80% of the differences in dog height and weight are explained by variation in just 7 regions of the dog genome. And it turns out there are a very small number of differences which have been under breeding selection by us humans, of course, which have actually led to all these various differences. A good reminder that a little bit of genetic variation can go a long way, if you like. What about the biological understanding of a species? Well, as far as living species are concerned, a species just consists of a group of populations which do not normally breed with other such groups. It's quite easy to make a biological definition when those groups are alive. That speciation generally happens by allopatric mechanisms, which happens when a population splits into two, as here, or sometimes by sympatric mechanisms, whereby speciation more rarely can occur even within a population for various genetic reasons. But in this sort of more common allopatric speciation, here you've got your population species, let's say a population of snails or something. Let's say a river comes in the middle and divides up the population, and so this two populations live apart for a very long time, and then eventually the river dries up, and so the populations get together again, and they find they can no longer interbreed. They have speciated by this reproductive isolation. And that's thought to be the sort of main way that animals at least speciate. When it comes to plants, life is a little bit different. I mean, you've heard probably the different distinction made between macroevolution and microevolution, that sort of thing. So macroevolution is often used to describe the transition of one species into another. It doesn't necessarily mean that any changes have taken place that are any different actually from what goes on in microevolution, but in plant speciation it often is very different, and this is an example known as polyploidy. This is an actual example from a plant called Tragopogon that was introduced into the United States in the early part of the 20th century, and it's speciated many, many times since that time. Its history of speciation has been tracked. So, and what happens is here you've got two species of Tragopogon. They've each got 6 chromosome pairs, and now and again, they wouldn't normally cross-pollinate, but now and again they do, and they form generally an infertile hybrid, but occasionally, for reasons not known, there is a multiplication of the chromosomes in the progeny, and you can get a new species formed in that way by this process of polyploidy. So here's Tragopogon maris, which has these 2 parental species, and it's unable to hybridize with either of the parents. It's got double the chromosome number. It actually has all the chromosomes from both parents. So this sort of chromosomal multiplication is a very common way of speciation in plants. It happens over a period of a few days and whatever. And in fact, you'll probably find many of the flowers in your back, if you have a back garden, then many of those flowers would be, they would have speciated in this particular way. So for animals, speciation is generally a bit slower, but it can actually be relatively fast. One very much studied sort of laboratory, in a way a living laboratory in this respect, are the cichlid freshwater fishes that live in the Great Lakes of Africa. And in fact, there are more than 2,000 species of cichlid. 500 of these species have evolved in Lake Victoria alone over the past 100,000 years. And each species has its own ecological niche, its own food chain, its own coloring, and so forth and so on. So they really are quite distinct. And there's a recent article in Nature, in fact, that has shown that it's gene duplication, which has actually led to speciation in many of these cases. So this is a relatively rapid speciation events over periods of thousands of years, not millions, thousands of years. Notice that in the case of our own evolution, the suggestion is not that we evolved from apes, something like that, but rather that we last shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos about 5-6 million years ago, something like that. And so since that time of convergence, the chimps, there were no chimps 6 million years ago. I think the oldest chimp fossils are only about 600,000 years old, actually. So they have been evolving down their particular way. We've been evolving down our particular way, probably around something between 5 or 10 intermediate species. It's hard to know, actually. We've got too many examples, not too few now, between us and the last common ancestor with the chimpanzees. So this date is something like 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Up until a few months ago, I was saying 200,000 years ago, but then a paper came out about some recent discoveries of fossil skull, a whole collection of fossil skulls, human, anatomically modern human fossil skulls in Morocco, and those have been dated quite clearly to around 300,000 years ago. So 200,000 to 300,000 years ago in Africa is roughly the time at which Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerged. In fact, some limited emigration of our species had already happened by around 115,000 years ago. They got as far as the Levant. There are partial skeletons of Homo sapiens that have been found in what is now Israel up here. But it's thought, based mostly on genetic data, that the biggest waves of migration out of Africa started from around 70,000 years ago. And people, first of all, the weather in Europe was pretty bad at that time. You wouldn't want to go there. It hasn't improved greatly, but it's a bit better. But anyway, people went to the east and they headed down. Now, this is a revised date of a couple of weeks ago, actually. Probably around 65,000 years ago, there were people in Australia. They spread into China. And then they backtracked. When the weather got a little bit better, they backtracked into Europe around 43,000 years ago. And about 18,000 years ago, they were wading across the Bering Strait here, or it might even have been joined here, and heading down into the Americas. So that's the current thinking of the way that human evolution is operated in terms of the world population. Based on genetics, it's been estimated that by several research groups, in fact, that there was a population, a very small population, let's say 200,000 years ago, whenever it was, in Africa, that never went more than between 9,000 to 12,000 reproductively active individuals. Okay, there was certainly never one couple from whom all humankind came, but it was a pretty small population. It could easily have gone extinct, but it didn't, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so that's a happy thought for us. But it's based, as I say, on genetic data. Now, until 2010, there was a pretty well-established kind of replacement model for the spread of humans around the world. In other words, the idea was that modern humans evolved in Africa, they came out of Africa, they spread around the world, and they replaced just about everybody who was there, any other hominins or precursors or that sort of thing. They replaced them. But now the situation's got more complicated, and the reason for that is DNA sequencing has become now so efficient and so effective and so forth. And it turns out there has been some limited amount of interbreeding. For example, all non-Africans, including probably most of us here this evening then, contain something like 1.5 to 2.1% Neanderthal DNA in our genomes. Okay, and some of it has some positive effects, by the way. There's also a first cousin of the Neanderthals called the Denisovans, after a Denisovan cave from North China, where there's some very well preserved DNA, because it's so cold, up in that part of the world. And it's all based on just one tooth and one finger, but very good DNA sequence. And these Denisovans look like first cousins of Neanderthals. They're closer to Neanderthals than to us. At the same time, though, in certain populations in Southeast Asia, it turns out that there's about 1 to up as much as 6% Denisovan DNA. Populations like Melanesians, Australians, Polynesians, that's Aboriginal Australians, and so forth. Some of those southeastern populations seem to have interbred to some degree with the Denisovans. So overall now, a picture is emerging, therefore, where there must have been, or there may have been, several hominin species as precursors of humans, if you like, living at the same time as recently as 30 to 80,000 years ago. Some of them interbred with humans, not a lot, but enough to leave their visiting cards in the current human population. And if we keep then to a very strict definition of a biological species as a population that never interbreeds with another population, then we have only been clearly a human population in that sense for definitely the last 30,000 years, probably longer, but it does impact on the way we think about speciation here. Okay, here some people ask whether human evolution is still continuing, and here's one answer to that question. That is a joke, by the way, just so you know. Okay, it's just to see if anyone's awake at this point. Okay, so right. Okay, and just before we leave the topic of evolution, it's worth emphasizing the theory itself, as I mentioned earlier, is evolving. Right now, there's quite an active debate going on between those biologists who think we need some major components added to the theory to really make sense of it all. There's the traditionalists who are holding back, saying, no, the kind of introduction I gave you, that's quite sufficient, and so forth. And Martin Novak's an interesting character, actually. He's a very brilliant evolutionary biologist. Actually, he's a mathematician at Harvard, and he would like to add cooperation as a third key element in the evolutionary theory, along with variation and natural selection and so forth. There's also a very active discussion going on between the group selectionists and the individual and the selectionists who believe that the individual is the unit of selection and so on. I don't know if Dawkins is still holding out for the gene as a unit of selection, but you get these kind of debates and discussions going on. So, as I say, we shouldn't think of evolution as a static theory. No theory is static in science. Okay, right, that's a bit about evolution. And now we're going to switch to creation. Okay, sudden switch here. What about the Christian doctrine of creation? So all I'm going to do this evening is summarize a very traditional understanding of God as creator. It's based on huge biblical literature on this topic. It's based on the writings of the early church fathers. It's based on Thomas Aquinas and people like the 13th century, based on the reformers, about whom we've been thinking, some of us, a lot over this past week and so on. So what I want to present here is not some theological response to evolution, because this goes way back. I mean, this is a couple of thousand years, before evolution was ever dreamt up and thought about. So all we're looking at here is the kind of traditional Christian doctrine of creation. So the picture that emerges from the biblical understanding of creation and from theological reflection as well is of a God, the omnipotent, supreme God, who is the source and the ultimate source, the ultimate creator, the prime cause of everything that exists. So everything that exists only came into existence because God has brought it into existence in this creation worldview. And so existence, what do we mean by that? Well, it just means anything that exists. It doesn't matter if it's the periodic table, or Higgs bosons, or the laws of nature, or quantum vacuums, or you, me, rabbits, plants, whatever it is. If it exists, then it's part of that created order within this kind of theistic matrix. Now, I realize that quite like the people here this evening who don't believe in God, that's fine, you're absolutely welcome here. My aim is not to try and give you arguments for the existence of God here this evening. What I do want to do, though, is to try and explain what Christians mean when they talk about God as creator, because a lot of confusion in this discussion happens, I think, by not really understanding what do we mean by creation. Now, one challenge comes from the way in which we use the word create in the English language, and then we apply it to God. So, when we make things, we work, of course, with already existing material to make something new. And so the human act of creating is actually not the complete cause of what is produced. We're starting with materials, remember? Okay. But God's creative work is the complete cause of what is produced. And I've got a bit of a long quote up here by the theologian Bill Carroll. It's worth quoting in full, I think, just to get our heads around this. This is pure Thomas Aquinas, by the way, if you haven't read Thomas Aquinas. Quote, God's causality is so different from the causality of creatures that there is no competition between the two. That is, we do not need to limit, as it were, God's causality to make room for the causality of creatures. God causes creatures to be causes. Okay, let's pause on that, get a head around that. God causes creatures to be causes. Okay. Creation is not essentially some distant event. Rather, it is the ongoing, complete causing of the existence of all that is. At this very moment, were God not causing all that is to exist, there would be nothing at all. Creation concerns, first of all, the origin of the universe, not its temporal beginning, close quote. So I know that's a bit heavyweight theology for a Friday evening, but it's rather key, actually, to really get your head around that. So creation is about ontology. It's about the existence of things. It's about the meaning of their existence. Now, speaking of God as creator, then, doesn't mean that we're promoting some alternative mechanism as to how creation happens compared to that which is described by scientists. We're talking about something, a complementary narrative, an interpretation of here of what is the meaning of existence, what it's all about, why it's there, and so forth. And of course, when we think about that, we realize it's this kind of created order that actually renders science possible. So since God is not encompassed, he's not constrained in any way by the present created order in which we find ourselves, that means that we as human creatures, we're not in a very good position really to kind of guess what God might do. Okay, we're not in a good position for that. And that idea, of course, has deep theological roots. So if you go back into the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah says, "For my thoughts," this is God speaking through the prophet Isaiah, he says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And then the psalmist says, Psalm 115, "Our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him." Okay, you can't box up God and tell him what to do. You can only simply seek to understand what he does in the created order. And historians of science have often pointed to this kind of idea, which is called the voluntarist idea of God's created work, as leading to empirical processes within the history of science and the foundations of modern science, because if you can't guess ahead of time what God does, well, you better do experiments. As Bacon said, you better torture nature, you better find out, you better do experiments to find out how it all works, and so on. No one could simply guess how the created order works based on simple human logic. Think about, just in your mind's eye now, just go back 4 billion years. The planet here is empty of any life. It's not green, there are no life forms. It's just a desolate, inchoate mass of disorganized materials. It's undergoing frequent asteroid bombardment. I mean, nobody, if you were around at that time, nobody could dream at that point that it would eventually become the home of saints and sinners. And so you just wouldn't know. I mean, it's only now we know, of course, but and some of these thought experiments might help us a little bit in trying to think our way around some of these issues. In fact, this point about contingency was made explicitly by the great philosopher, natural philosopher René Descartes in his Principles of Philosophy, when he said, "Since there are countless different configurations which God might have instituted here, experience alone must teach us which configurations he actually selected in preference to the rest. We are thus free to make any assumption on these matters with the sole proviso that all the consequences of our assumption must agree with experience." Close quote. Now, along with that concept of God is sort of transcendent, beyond time and outside of our human understanding, comes also another biblical insistence, which we hold in tension, and that is the insistence that God is immanent in the created order. God is involved moment by moment, second by second, in upholding and sustaining this whole creation in which we find ourselves. And so God's faithfulness then is being displayed in this, what we call gnomic regularity, the law-like behavior of matter, its reproducibility, without which science would not be possible and we wouldn't be here. And this is a Trinitarian immanence. Right at the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 1:3, we find the Spirit of God sweeping over the waters, ready to bring order out of this formless and empty earth. Tohu ve'bohu. The theologian Jürgen Moltmann expresses the point. The divine spirit, he writes, the Ruach, is the creative power and the presence of God in his creation. The whole of creation is a fabric woven by the Spirit and is therefore a reality to which the Spirit gives form. Close quote. Calvin, we've been thinking about, along with Luther as well, the past week especially. He put it this way in 1536 in his Institutes, and I quote from Calvin, "For it is the Spirit who, everywhere diffuse, sustains all things, causes them to grow and quickens them in heaven and on earth. In transfusing into all things his energy and breathing into them essence, life, and movement, he is indeed plainly divine." Here's the immanence of God in the created order. And the New Testament tells us that we live in what we might call a Christological creation. And using one of the most powerful metaphors that we have anywhere in the whole of the Bible, John, in his Gospel, in his first chapter, what we call the prologue, the beginning, the introduction, says that through the Logos, through Christ, through the Logos, the Word, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. A very startling claim to put right at the beginning, of your book, your wonderful book. And then in Colossians, when Paul is writing to his letter to the church in Colossae, he writes that by the Son of God, quote, "all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Or in some translations, in him all things consist. So in other words, he's saying, look, the whole complete created order in all its breadth and diversity goes on existing by the same divine word, the Lord Jesus Christ, through whom all things were made in the first place. It's quite an amazing claim. Well, it's hard perhaps also to get our heads around God's immanence in creation. It's been likened, various metaphors have been used. It's often been likened to the musical composer in relation to a great piece of music. A composer both composes and conducts the music at the same time. It's an ongoing, dynamic creation. It's still in process. It has a past, it has a present, it has a future. Charles Raven from my own university was master of Christ College in Cambridge. That's the college where Darwin studied as an undergraduate. Charles Raven was a very influential voice in the science religion kind of dialogue in the first part of the 20th century. He put it like this, I like this. He said, God as Father was like an artist deciding to create a picture. God the Son was the design on which the work was modeled, and the Holy Spirit was the creative energy in the artist that created the picture. It's a Trinitarian creation in Christian theology. I hope all of this helps us to understand why the God of the gaps idea, which you've probably heard about, is just really unsatisfactory. What do we mean by that? Well, here we're representing the whole of this current scientific knowledge by this kind of Swiss cheese with holes in it on the left-hand side of your screen. And of course, there's lots and lots of gaps in our scientific knowledge. For example, when did the first cell come into being? How did the first genetic code get going? What was about the origin of life? And so on. We have lots of gaps, okay. And the temptation that some people have, both atheists have this temptation and believers have this temptation, is to say, well, God did it. Okay, so God's the explanation for that little white circle there. God is the one who did it. Okay. Now the problem with that, of course, there are several problems. Well, first of all, is a theological problem, because if you take on board the kind of traditional Christian understanding of creation, then God is the author of the whole of creation. And whether we currently understand it, bits of it scientifically or not, is really by the by. It makes no difference at all to this understanding of God as creator and what that means in terms of this created order in which we live. So there's a theological problem here, there's a practical problem. If you really want to put your God in those gaps, well, science is going to fill them up, I can tell you that. If it's the sort of thing that science is good at, wait around a bit, or you might have to wait a century, but eventually science will fill up the gaps. And then what happens to your idea of God? It's a sort of shrinking idea of God. It's very unsatisfactory. If you go back to the early 5th century, when Augustine of Hippo was writing his great commentary, the literal interpretation of Genesis, there, when he was talking about miracles, actually, he said, nature is what God does. Nature is what God does. And I find that a very powerful slogan, if you like, and a good reminder that everything we investigate as scientists is part of the created order. There is nothing else to investigate. So as I say, our ignorance about aspects of it has no theological meaning or inferences at all. And so we can ask the question, well, what do we biologists actually do in our research? Well, clearly what we're trying to do is to, if you have this theistic worldview, if you're a Christian scientist, a scientist who is a Christian as I am, then this is the kind of picture you have. You have God as the primary cause. You have those secondary causes that Aquinas call them, all those mechanisms and processes whereby God brings about all the stuff that we see in this universe. And the science bit, what we do as scientists is to seek to investigate those secondary causes. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. We can't investigate the primary cause. How can you do that? That's impossible. But we can, for sure, do as good a job as we can on the secondary causes. So does that then entail some sort of deterministic universe in which God is the divine puppet master, sort of micromanaging every event? Is that the picture we should get out of this? I want to say no. That's no necessary consequence of the creation theology that I've been outlining for you this evening. For by faithfully guaranteeing the order, the gnomic regularity in the properties of matter by his immanence in the created order, so by the same token, God bestows upon the created order its own functional integrity. We find some hint of this in Genesis chapter 1, where God uses the language, if you like, of gracious allowance, where he says, well, let the land produce vegetation. Let the land do this and that and the other. So matter does what matter does. It's consistent. It has its own integrity because it's an integrity bestowed on it by God. And if it didn't, then all coherence would be gone, wouldn't it? If we didn't know what matter was going to do in a few seconds' time, it would be an impossible and nightmarish kind of world in which to live. In fact, indeed, we wouldn't be here because you need that reproducibility and consistency in order for biological life to exist. So clearly what we have here, and what I want to suggest to you this evening, is we have two complementary narratives. When we're thinking about creation and evolution, we have the science, which is asking this how question: how does God bring biological diversity into being by means of this long evolutionary process? And we've got theology addressing the question of why. Why is it there? Why does it bother to exist? What's it all about? What's the purpose of this whole creation in which we find ourselves? Now, we can't possibly derive the creation doctrine of God from the evolutionary process, but we can argue that the process is consistent with the existence of a creator God who has intentions and purposes for the world. Now, I'm sure this has raised many different questions in your mind. I'm so glad we're going to have a good time of questions this evening. And I'm going to skip one or two questions I popped in here because I want to find out what your questions might be. But I think as we look at the question again, creation or evolution, do we have to choose? I don't think so. I don't think we do have to choose. Personally, I've never seen any particular tension between the two. I've simply grown up with both. I can never remember a time, actually, when I didn't believe in God as creator. I can't remember a time when I didn't believe in Darwinian evolution. Ever since doing it at A-level at school, I just thought, well, that was pretty good. It's obviously well supported by the data, and I'm simply grown up with both. And so I'm constantly still surprised, to find that some people do have a problem in relating those two together. But I just want to suggest these are two complementary aspects of the same reality, and there indeed is no need to make a choice between appreciating the beauty of an ice cream and enjoying its taste. And with that thought in mind, I think it's high time we had a break for drinks and refreshments. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Here are a few questions from folk who are saying, I don't understand the need for a God or gods at all. Your understanding of God is the same as mine of the universe. Why do I need a God for a consistent worldview and a moral, fulfilling life?
Okay, well, we've just had the coffee, but I know where that question came from. Okay, yeah, thank you. No, we just had that good discussion in the break here, actually. So, yes, I mean, justifying or arguing for the existence of God is a whole other 1 hour lecture and more and so forth. And, but I think I can tell you why I'm a Christian and why I believe in God at least. So I think I can think of 3 levels, if you like, in which this discussion takes place. The first is an intellectual level, and it's a pondering about the nature of the universe, the nature of who we are, and the question of why we're here and what gives the inference to the best explanation for that. Okay, so these are arguments, if you like, that they're not scientific arguments. These are more philosophical or rational arguments that reflect upon the meaning of existence and why does existence have a meaning, and if so, what might it be? Okay. Let me just touch on that one point I'd like to mention there, because often what you find in the new atheist rhetoric is about evolutionary biology is that the history of evolution, when you look at it, is necessarily without purpose. Okay, necessarily so. It's just simply, it's random and chance, and well, that could have gone this way or that way, all that kind of thing. I have to say, actually, when I have looked carefully, if you look carefully at evolutionary biology, it just doesn't look like that. Okay, it does not look like that. It's a very constrained process. It's highly orderly in many ways, to some degree predictable, not much, a little bit. It's obviously complex. But when you actually look at evolutionary history and you look at the very early origin of life and so forth, compared to where we are now, with these complex brains sitting between our ears and this very complex system of biological organisms, I mean, it's very hard to believe that it's necessarily without purpose. I don't think that shows that it is with a purpose, but I want to point out that it doesn't look like it's necessarily without purpose. Okay, so one can enter into all those discussions. So the next level then would be, for me, why am I a Christian? Why do I believe in God? Because of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, and I'm very convinced about that, and do believe that the evidence, the historical evidence for his life and the reasons for his death and resurrection are strong. So that would be the second level. The third level would be personal experience, of just the experience of being a Christian for a long time, okay, and the experience of others and the experience of other people that I meet who have the same faith in many different parts of the world. And I've always found that very impressive, that you can, immediately you know where they're coming from, you know, and so that sense of personal experience is very powerful as well. So I think there's 3 levels you can think about, and different people. Yeah.
So hang on, we're just getting a question about people who don't believe in Jesus. There's one in here that's pretty similar. Why not Islam? It answers the same questions. I know Muslim scientists with the same views.
Yes, we were talking about that also. So we've got a good cluster of questions from our front row participants here. Thank you very much. That's great. Okay. So we were just discussing, I mean, actually, as far as the doctrine of God as creator in Islam is, it's very similar to the doctrine of God as creator in Christianity and Judaism as well, of course. In the Abrahamic faiths, I mean, we have conferences and courses and stuff, you know, where, you know, we got people from the different faiths present, different Abrahamic faiths. Once you go out of the Abrahamic faiths, it's a different discussion, because currently these are monistic religions, whereas the Abrahamic faiths believe in a God who is a creator, who is there, who is distinct from the creation which he's brought into being. Of course, as we were also discussing, where Christianity would be different and distinct is in the role of Jesus in the creation. So we looked earlier on at John's Gospel, chapter 1, where the claim is made that without Jesus, without the Word, nothing was made that has been made. Okay, so pointing to the divinity of Christ, the pre-existence of Christ, his eternal nature, and his power in creation. So that's partly why I'm a Christian, because you have to say, well, either this is utter nonsense, really, you know, it really is total nonsense, or then you start taking it seriously and thinking about that. So that's, I think we're a bit on a knife edge on that one. So if you ask the question, well, why this faith and not another, I say, well, we'll look at them and see what the claims are and so forth. And I've lived in Muslim countries for 15 years, so I know Islam pretty well. I've taught biology to Muslims for 15 years, so I know their responses pretty well. I don't know other religions nearly so well, but probably we don't all have time to sit down and study every religion in the world, but we can do 2 or 3 maybe and do it properly. And I think the reason I'm a Christian is because of the unique claims of Christ to be the Son of God and indeed to be the Creator.
Here's one. Nature is what God does. Does he do anything else? E.g., how does he rule the nations, address personal and corporate disaster, and answer prayer?
Yes, so the concept of God in Christian faith is certainly of a personal God. And when you become a Christian, you come to know God through Christ. And that means a huge amount, really. And it means that you can talk to God in prayer. And certainly God is a prayer-answering God, a God who listens to prayer. And prayer is central to Christian faith and Christian life. And so by taking Augustine's slogan right out of context from the literal commentary on Genesis, obviously one is not thinking that's all that God does. No, of course not. No, God is active in the world. God is active in people. God is active in answering prayer. God is active in the lives of people who trust in him, and so forth. So here you have the sort of backcloth, if you like, of the created order, what I've been calling the created order, what some people might call nature. Okay, so here's the existence that we live in, that is orderly and that is, it has gnomic regularity, it's accessible by science, it's intelligible. It's as Einstein said, you know, the most amazing thing about the universe is its intelligibility, the fact that we are able to understand some of it at least. So that's the backcloth. And then we have our own personal lives. You have God's personal interaction with the lives of individuals and of people and so forth. So yeah, God is immanent in many different levels, many different ways, I would want to say, as a personal God.
Someone says, I quite see the connection between creation and evolution. How would you explain the Genesis version of creation to children? On the first day, God created, and so on.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I would certainly want to take the early chapters of Genesis as theological essays. I think they're very profound theological essays. They make some key points without which you cannot understand the rest of the Bible. Basically, they are saying, well, here's one God, not lots of gods, but one God who does everything, and that's what Genesis 1 is all about, and God who is unlike all the polytheistic nations around who believed that there were different gods for every day of the week, if you like, it was saying, no, actually, there's one God who does all things. How do you communicate that to children? I'm not an expert on that. Obviously, children will... Well, I can mention one thing, actually, that we in the Faringdon Institute have noticed a great lack of good books on science of faith for kids aged 2 to 12, which will actually eventually be available in schools and places, which hopefully will have a slightly better way of explaining, those sort of things through metaphor and imagery and so forth. The problem is, of course, there's a huge amount of creationist literature around, which is not very helpful, where you've got people riding on the backs of dinosaurs and that sort of thing, which I think is a bit misleading, to say the least. Okay, so in other words, there's a lot of work to be done in this area, I think, to communicate those sort of passages in a way that's appropriate for children of that age. But I'm not an expert on that, I can tell you that.
Okay, a couple of questions touching on intelligent design, IDs, so-called. Why do so many evolutionists get so outraged about intelligent design? How does intelligent design fit into the models you showed? Another one says many living things contain irreducible complexity. How do they evolve from simple organisms?
Yeah, let's just backtrack here one step, maybe just to think about what people mean when they talk about intelligent design. Okay, so there's intelligent design with a small I and a small d, and there's intelligent design with a big I and a big D. Okay, so let's think about, I think this is about the latter one, ID, which is a movement which began in the States in the early 1990s, partly people reacting against a very kind of atheistic or materialistic way of thinking about evolution, naturalistic and so forth, that sort of thing. And so the arguments made by intelligent design proponents center around the idea that there are very complex things in biology. We talked about, I mentioned the origin of the cell, the origin of the genetic code, those sort of things. Bacterial flagellum, these little wavy things that bacteria use to swim around with, which have about 30 proteins in. They are quite complex, actually. So life is full of complicated things. And so the next step in the argument then is to say, evolution is not going to explain that, okay? Therefore, this is designed, okay, somehow designed by a designer. They're rather hesitant about mentioning the word God there because they want to sort of make it look like a straightforward philosophical kind of argument. Of course, there are many problems with this type of approach, and I'll just mention a couple. I think one of the problems is so many of the examples that intelligent design people put forward, and you read a lot of them in a book by Michael Behe called Darwin's Black Box. It was published in 1996. There's lots and lots of examples, those bog standard biochemistry type of things. If you look back now, I mean, 1996 isn't all that long ago, 20 years, but already many of those examples have been addressed in evolutionary biology literature. And for example, the evolution of the flagellum is pretty well understood, actually, in a modular terms. Different modules in that flagellum have different functions, and so each stage along the way, at least it's possible to build up a pretty convincing stage post whereby this can happen. So that's one problem, it's just a sort of, it's actually a design of the gaps idea. That's the other real problem. So here you have a gap in our present scientific knowledge, and you say, here's the designer, and you put the designer in the little, you remember the model we had with the little white holes that represent those gaps? You put your designer in the gap, and obviously that gap is going to be filled up. And then what happens to your idea of design? Okay, so therefore your designer is constantly retreating before the advance of science because of bad theology, I think. I think ID is just bad theology, and that's, personally, I mean, as a Christian, that's why I don't believe it. Mostly for theological reasons, but also for the kind of scientific reasons that I just mentioned.
Okay, in your book, you suggest an age for the universe of about 14 billion years. The constant decay of radioisotopes is an important element of evidence that you present for this. As an evangelical Christian, I anticipate that you agree that we know God has intervened in history and changed the law of physics at least once at the resurrection of Jesus, and will change them again when he recreates the heavens and earth at the end of time. So do you accept that the laws of physics may have been different at other times, during the initial period of creation, for example, and therefore the age of the universe may not be 14 billion years?
I think so thinking about the resurrection and extrapolating to a change in the laws of physics, that's a pretty big leap. Okay, so in other words, the resurrection is, in Christian theology, is a singularity. There has only been one person in our understanding who ever died and then rose from the dead and did not die again. Okay, so that's pretty central to Christian faith. It doesn't entail changing the whole laws of physics. It's the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead as a unique event, which is central to why I'm here, and I suppose, it's central to Christian faith. But if you actually believe then that the laws, God changes the laws of physics at some stage, then it doesn't fit at all well, as far as I can see, with the kind of God that we read about in the Bible, who is faithful, who is consistent in what he does in the created order, which is what makes science possible, and a God of faithfulness and a God who can be trusted. And I think once you introduce the idea of a God who kind of messes around with things, changes laws at different eras or something, then theologically I think that's highly problematic actually, and it doesn't fit at all with what I see in the kind of God that I read about in the Bible. Quite apart from that, there simply is no evidence scientifically that that's happened. Now, of course, the rotation of the Earth, there are some things that have changed. We mustn't think statically. There's good evidence that the time of the Earth's rotation was different, many millions of years ago, and so forth. And there are some, in other words, things do change. We're not living in a static universe, but that's very different from the claim that the laws of physics have changed in some way, and I just don't think there's no evidence for that at all. So.
And perhaps similarly, if somebody believes in six-day creation, could it not be compatible with science if things were created with a perceived age? A created tree was a tree, so it looked like it was 100 or 200 years old from the moment it was created.
This goes back, by the way, this is a fascinating theory. This goes back to Philip Henry Goss and his famous book in the 19th century, and he wrote a book called Omphalos. Omphalos is the Greek for a navel, okay? So, were Adam and Eve born with their tummy buttons? Okay, discuss. So this is the question. Okay, so and he was made fun of at that time. We're talking about 1860s, I think it was. About then he was published that book. He was made a lot of fun of at the time. He had a rather extraordinary idea. He had the idea actually that the whole of creation is sort of in the mind of God, and a bit like a merry-go-round. And then God sort of says, zap, and then it's all instantiated at a certain moment in time. So everything is born, everything appears in the beginning of creation, physical creation, looking like it has age. And I think that's where this sort of idea is coming from, actually. Again, I would just point you to the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible, and this is a God of tricks. This is a God who's kind of deceiving people. Do we really believe in a God who, you have the other who puts fossils in the ground, to deceive people that the earth is really old when it really isn't, okay? Is that the sort of God that Christians believe in? I don't think so. I think we believe in a God who's faithful, who is consistent, and you just go through Proverbs, go through Psalms, read them, and it's all about the consistency of God, a God who keeps his promises to his people, but a God who also is faithful in creation. Read Psalm 104, and a God who is continually upholding and sustaining the created order. So that's more the sort of God that I believe in. I don't believe in a God who goes around deceiving us and putting stuff, in the physical universe that might deceive us about what he does. I don't think God's like that.
Thank you. Are you saying that God put everything in place and evolution has taken it from there? Or are you saying that God is still involved in creating all new things?
Well, the kind of doctrine of creation I was trying to present is a God. So creation has three tenses, okay, in biblical language. It has past tense, present tense, future tense, okay. So God is active in creation all the time. If you go to the Old Testament, there is a strong word in Hebrew used for God's creative work, the word bara. The word bara, for bara, God is always the author of bara. There are other words for making and so forth in the Old Testament, which also refer to God making or human making. But in terms of bara, it's always God who makes. But you find God, bara, he makes the wind, God creates the people of Israel, okay. So all kinds of ongoing processes are referred to as bara in the Old Testament. So I think the picture we get is much more of a God who is active, and he's, as I said, like the musician, the composer, the musician, or improvising jazz, if you prefer that, okay. So here's a God who is active in the created order. So the whole evolutionary process is just one little aspect of the whole big created order. That God, I would say, he's immanent in all the causing creatures to be causes. In other words, giving that functional integrity. So I quite like the idea or the metaphor of God as the author of a book. Okay, the danger is, and it sounds a bit sort of deterministic. But God as the author of the book means that God is the author of the whole book, right, all the way through from beginning to end. Okay, And so there are no gaps. God is the total creator of everything.
A number of people have raised the question as whether there are other organizing principles than natural selection involved in the development of certain organs, such as eyes. What do you think?
I mean, eyes happen to be a particularly easy example, actually, to explain through basic genetic variation and natural selection. I mean, it's a problem for Darwin because he didn't have many examples of intermediate organisms that had simpler eyes and so on. I mean, you can line up a whole range of organisms that have eyes ranging all the way from a very simple little concave thing, which is just about with some photoreceptor cells on the inside of the concave, which is fine for what you need it to be if you're a unicellular organism. But you can go all the way through evolutionary history and find a range of eyes of different types and developing very simple and getting more complex. So I think actually the eye is quite I think the eye is quite a simple one actually for natural selection, and you can track the various chemicals used, and you can track the origins of photoreceptors and so forth, and you can build up a pretty good. I mean, there's a whole book on the evolution of the eye actually, if you want that one. But there are other things. I don't know why you chose the eye, because that's the easy one. I mean, I think there are other aspects of evolutionary outputs, if you like, where I think there is room, and I think most evolutionary biologists don't think the theory is finished. There might be other aspects that need to be brought in. I mentioned Martin Novak, who believes that cooperation should be a central part of the evolutionary theory, simply because cooperation is there all over the place. Right back to the beginning, the stromatolites, 3.5 billion years ago, these wonderful fossilized mats of bacteria. I mean, so the earliest fossils we have of life actually are communal life, okay, which is fascinating. So I think there are other ideas that almost certainly will be brought into evolutionary theory as time goes along. So I don't think the core will be lost. Variation, natural selection, I think, is the core, but it's going to be amplified, I think, as we go along, probably. I hope so.
Thank you. If Jesus came to earth in human form, this must mean that human evolution has reached its conclusion. No further human evolution can occur, since it would be in advance of Jesus.
No, that's a great question. I mean, there are plenty of reasons, though, why. I mean, most biologists think that serious human evolution has slowed down or is not going to go anywhere. Now, it depends, of course. Now, if you're referring to evolution as simply being a change in genetic variation in different populations, now that's happening all the time, okay. And there is selection on human populations, especially to bring about resistance to pathogens. I mean, you know about various genetic mutations that give, when they're in a single copy, in other words, only on one chromosome, that mutant will give those individuals some resistance against malaria, things like thalassemia, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. I can give you a little list there, and you'll find many of those mutants quite spread around in areas which either are or used to be subject to malarial disease. So the human population is evolving in genetic terms in that sense, but in terms of speciation or becoming something separate, that's very, very unlikely for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is, as we were talking about, you really need reproductive isolation for speciation to occur, and in this world it's very unlikely you're going to get reproductive isolation. Now, you can get into sci-fi scenarios whereby you can send people off to Mars and they live there for 100,000 years. But to be honest, when they get to Mars, what are they going to do? They're going to create a very Earth-like environment, because that's the only way they can live. So it's unlikely they're going to become adapted in some way to a Martian environment. I don't think that's going to happen. So in other words, it's very unlikely that we're going to see. And one other thing, of course, is very important to remember. In a way, the teaching of Jesus, which led to the foundation of hospitals and medical care in so many different countries, has necessarily slowed down, anyway, the process of human evolution. Because clearly, if you're allowing people who would normally have died before reproductive age, if you're caring for them, which we should be, and looking after them, which we should be, then clearly the selection pressure is going to be lessened in that population, because those people will be alive and they will reproduce and they will pass on their various genes, whatever, for their mutant genes to the next generation and so on, to their progeny. So that's part of the story as well, actually. So.
Dennis, thank you very much. Been a whole lot of questions there. Our time has run out, but if anybody wants to have a quick word with Denis afterwards, please do. Thank you all very much for coming. You'll see from the flyer on your seats that our next meeting in this series is here early in January, the 11th of January. Bishop of Swindon, Lee Rayfield, will be speaking on designer babies, should we play God? Lee Rayfield's a member of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA. So do come along, that'll be very interesting. Put the date in your 2018 diary and bring friends. Please do fill in the feedback form that you've had on your seats. That'll help us as we prepare for the next meetings, and pop them in any of the boxes that we've used for questions on your way out, please. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's helped in any way towards this evening, and especially the planning team and the hosting team. And may we close our evening by once again warmly thanking our speaker tonight, Denis Alexander. Thank you, Denis.